All right, so our presentation's on a little bit of overview of ransomware. First, we're going to talk about that, and we're going to kind of then talk about a piece of ransomware that we found via social media monitoring type of thing going on back in late August, and we were able to basically perform a man-in-the-middle attack on the ransomware and intercept the key going across and essentially decrypt files without having to pay the ransom. So we'll talk about that in the second half of the talk. So like I just said, we're going to kind of go over the state of ransomware. We're going to talk about its profitability, what makes it simple in comparison to banking Trojans, really, the type of one-size-fits-all thing, and then we'll move into ransomware. Like I said, we'll give you guys basically a rundown of network activity, encryption, decryption, and then how we carried out the man-in-the-middle attack. And we'll wrap it up and then happily take any questions that anyone has. First, an introduction. Who are we? My name's Jason Davison, and this is King Salemo. We work at PhishLabs, and we get to play with malware on a regular basis.
Yeah.
Anything to add?
No. I just want to know which one I am.
I'm definitely in the orange suit. I got orange suit. So ransomware, the current ransomware pandemic. So why has ransomware become so popular? In 2016, that's really become the malware of choice amongst cyber criminals, if you will. In the end, like, cyber criminals are just businessmen, right? They're trying to make money. And they want to make money as efficiently as possible, meaning less work on their end, while still returning a decent profit for them. How can they gain the most money in the shortest amount of time, if you will? So that goes along with our first point, right? Ransomware is profitable. It's also relatively simple in comparison to banking Trojan. In banking Trojans, we'll talk about that a little bit later. Less moving parts. Just less movement of money, really, overall. You can make use of bitcoins and anonymity in bitcoins and bitcoin wallets. So that makes kind of ransomware more simplistic in the sense of getting paid and making money. One size fits all, right? So you really just have to, once you get your encryption right, and you have a semi-robust infrastructure, you can kind of tweak your payloads here and there to work on like detection and mitigating detection and things like that to make it a little bit more successful. But once ransomware runs, you're already successful, right? You've encrypted their files, and then it's either they're going to pay or they're not going to pay. So with banking Trojans in comparison here, I think Vautrac, right? The victim has to open the browser twice before Vautrac will provide web injects to when they navigate to their banking website and things like that. There's just much more moving parts and things going on with banking Trojans. So, like I said, Vautrac, anything to add on banking Trojan side?
Mm-hmm.
Good to go?
You covered it pretty well.
Thanks, bud. So, moving on to profitability, ransomware, the FBI stated the first 3 months of 2016 that ransomware had accumulated $209 million, and Lockheed came around, Lockheed being the first really major change in campaign and kind of swing things towards ransomware in 2016. It was about mid-February, February 12th or 16th, somewhere around there, was when Lockheed came out. And like I said on the second point here, major campaigns like Lockheed and Cerber are both successful based on spam volume alone. Now Lockheed, as far as I know, and as far as nobody else has alluded to, Lockheed being run by multiple groups, just by one group who spams out just loads and loads of samples via the NetCurious botnet. And Cerber is actually probably the most successful ransomware as a service campaign, where the original authors will basically lend their code base to people that want to give a ransomware campaign or give a ransomware run a go. So overall profit. Each Locky, so this Locky estimation was originally drafted in a report provided by the Talos Group in April, I believe. This is just to give you an idea of the potential profit that Locky could be spinning off. We can see here they did 2 different calculations based on whether victims were paying 1 Bitcoin or whether victims were paying half a Bitcoin. And over 12 months, you either make, if your victims per day stay the same, you're making $393 million or $196 million essentially, which is a good chunk of change. And I wish I made that much money. I just work for a year, I'm good. So here's an actual from a Checkpoint put out a great blog and a great white paper on insight into the Cerber ring and the Cerber group. And this image is actually from one of their blogs where they have where they are inside a Cerber panel, and you can see actual infection numbers here. And this is like hard numbers where the Talos Group was estimating based on payment and victims per day. These are hard numbers. This is what the Cerber author, the person utilizing the service at the time, this is what they're actually making. So we can see installs. Encryption started good, encryption started bad. Encryption's completed, and then we can see before the far right column, we can see the number of payments. And we also have a profit column on the very far right, where it shows exactly how much money they're making. So overall, they had 10,000 installs. I don't know how long this period is. Looks like from April 9th to April 23rd. So 10,000 installs with a profit of $53,000, which over the course of 2 weeks is a good chunk of change. And these are I like this image because, like I said, they're hard numbers. So it gives you an idea of actually what they're making. Ransomware makes use of operating system features, right? It's not like they're not homebrewing their own encryption, or if they are, chances are it's probably capable of being cracked or broken. They make use of operating system or the cryptographic libraries within the operating system, which makes for very simplistic, right? API calls, very simplistic.
Yeah.
And easy.
A lot of times when you see on movies where you see like these mad hackers sitting on the keyboard making the most sophisticated piece of malware you ever seen, and it's like uncrackable and they can't trace it or find anything. In real life, that never really happens, and in ransomware, it's even less so. The whole point of Locky was to make the payload as simple as possible. So what they did was they didn't do a lot of anti-VM sort of detection or anti-analysis detections. The reason for that is the more anti-analysis detections you put in, the more likelihood a security product's going to flag it. So if they don't do any sort of checks at all, then the likelihood of it succeeding and encrypting and perhaps encrypting things on shared drives and stuff increases a lot. And they don't care if they're in a VM or not. A lot of people are running stuff in virtualized environments, so they just care that it executes and that it's encrypting and stuff. Like hospitals per se. The reason hospitals pay out is because, let's say you have a nightly backup, right? Hospital has a lot that's happened since that nightly backup to say if it ran like, I don't know, lunchtime. So you look at that amount of data within that time that's accumulated, there's a reason a hospital's going to pay for that data, you know?
Can I ask a question real quick?
Yeah, go for it.
So, I mean, I don't know the answer to this, but like, are the targets for those, like you said, a hospital, like I can understand that. Is that like the large sums of money that move from majority, like big industry like a hospital, or like are like banks being hit too, or is it, do you know like what type of industries get it the most?
So a lot of people get hit, and the industries vary. The ones that are actually paying are people like hospitals,
They
small.
have no other option, right? Like your hospital, like you have to get your
Yeah.
data back.
Is it targeted at all, or is it just spammed out to as many people?
Well, that's the thing, right? With ransomware, it's like the more targets you have,
Right.
the higher chance of making money you have.
The emails are crafted in such a way where sometimes they will send it to hospitals looking like something that the hospital would see on a day-to-day basis. So like it'll be some medical terminology for them to elicit user interaction. Small sheriff's office end up paying because usually their IT isn't up to snuff, and they go back and look and they have like backups from like a week ago. So there's been plenty of small police offices that have paid out. I don't know who else has paid.
Wouldn't the hospitals though, if you're using something like Epic, like software like Epic or something like medical software like that,
Mhm.
your data's backed up to like for like years to
Yeah.
Epic. So why would they want to pay
So
these smaller hospitals that don't use like a large system like that? Because I know a lot of
Ye-
hospitals do this and stuff.
yeah, so it depends on when the ransomware runs, and it depends on the infrastructure. There are certain things that you think would be streamlined within a hospital, and certain things that may be configured in such a way that it was changed to accommodate some other piece of software. It really depends. Like big hospitals have paid out, and
it was the first one that I remember was a hospital out of LA, right?
Yeah.
That got smacked by Lockheed, and I think they ended up paying $17,000 total to get their files back.
yeah.
That is definitely one of the most notable. As far as targeting goes, I wouldn't say like some of the lures are crafted, or some of the initial email are like sent out. Like, so if you're you work at a hospital, then like he said, medical terminology, things like that. Financial institutions, invoices and things like that. Like, I want you to look at my invoice, or why am I have to pay this much money if it, like you're sending one to your bank. Torrent Locker used to be the most targeted as far as geo regions go.
Yeah.
They would do some really crazy like geo IP blocking, where you would have to come from that specific region, and they would even block some VPN nodes if you wanted to like try to get the payload right. So that's probably the most targeted that I've seen.
Yeah, and I'm not familiar with Epic. I'm not sure how that's actually running. So within a hospital, I know there's many different segments. The accounting group may be running in a different manner, as opposed to the ER or other segments. So they take advantage of that. And I'd have to look more into Epic to actually answer that question, actually.
I was just
Yeah.
curious. Thank you.
How do you protect yourself as a consumer?
Ooh, that's a good question.
That is a good question.
Click on anything ever.
Yeah.
So, a lot of people who don't pay is consumers. So that is, I think what we saw was like 2%.
Very, very
So,
low like
yeah.
consumers. Like, I know I have so many computers. I mean, I'm a little bit of a special case, but like if I have a Linux distro, right, and I'm like, oh, like I'll just look at it. I'm like, oh, I don't really care about my files. Time to put a new distro on. And I like to change distros all the time. So sometimes I'll back up, sometimes I won't. And I'm like essentially just blowing away my files because.
I mean, AV is only going to help you so much. I can tell you from personal experience, AV is really, really bad. I'd say there's certain vendors that are better than others. I could recommend some. I don't know if I'm allowed to do that. But I would say about 3 of them are better than most. And other than that, like, I don't even know how you get
Most
feeds.
vectors are going to be through your email, right?
Yeah.
Like they're going to be sent to you via email.
Mhm.
And I can't put myself in somebody else's mindset based on the things that I know. Like I delete all my emails, like
Yeah.
barely read them. And I just never click on anything. I don't know, like if it's,
And there's
I can't speak for
Just don't
people.
get that call from my dad, like,
Yeah.
So someone did a YouTube video about getting hit with a ransomware, and how he was saying that the backup utility he was using was impenetrable to the ransomware that he got infected with. It wasn't that it was impenetrable, as a lot of the ransomware that occurs is looking for certain extensions. So what happens is when his file is being backed up, it was some random extension for that particular piece of software, which is not going to be in the list of extensions that it's looking to encrypt. A lot of them, it's not going to encrypt as .exe, .dll, because they're not going to want to try to corrupt a file that's, important to the operating system. So they're not trying to bring the system down. They want their money. They want the ransom. So they're looking for .doc, .xls. They're looking for files that they know are going to have important data for you. So usually, a lot of them have a preloaded extension list, and those are the extensions they're looking to encrypt. So they're not going to mass blast and encrypt every single file in your system. Because 9 times out of 10, if they do that, they're going to hit something important. It's not going to run very well.
So they're not going to get like the system files itself.
Exactly.
The things that hold data of value to you.
Right.
Whether
So-
it's like priceless photos or like taxes.
Yeah. So photos, Excel documents, I may have accounting information.
Or
Word
they'll just
documents.
whitelist those directories, like the
Yeah.
important system directories. So they will go through and do some executables. Like if you have games or something, they can hit those, but then they'll make sure that like they don't hit system 32 and things like that, right? Yeah, going on the file extension thing, like if I have IDA open and I save my IDA database file, the IDB, because it's .idb is the extension, that doesn't get encrypted, because why would anybody have IDA files on their computer that's getting encrypted by ransomware? But I would say, depending on like, because most people too, the other thing, like this is kind of changing tides here. I don't know how many of you do banking on your actual computer, but a lot of like mobile banking, right? That's becoming much bigger. And so also the mobile attack vector is becoming more and more savory, if you will. Whereas, like I don't even, like I barely sign in to my banking website on my computer to do anything really. Like I don't use my computers for critical functions barely. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
How do you live?
I barely.
Stats that the mobile browser user use exceeded desktop browser use.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
I appreciate you backing me up.
Yeah.
Sounds like a juicy attack vector.
So that's-
Maybe
yeah,
there's a product
exactly.
we can sell
It is a
to,
juicy attack vector.
prevent people from downloading fraudulent mobile apps if only.
And I'm sure you're going to see a lot of this increase in the future towards things like mobile devices or IoT
No
devices.
one wants on that. It's
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
even using something like, say, someone says, well, I got like Dropbox, it backs it up all the time. This ransomware could actually go into the shares.
Yeah, so we were talking about that the other day. We were talking about how people have cloud services, but people end up mapping drives to the computer, and some actually go out and start encrypting stuff on shared drives. Depending on how the cloud's actually used, I was actually thinking about someone making, wouldn't even be clever. You could easily do it where it actually connects to some sort of cloud service and start encrypting files.
So if you have OneDrive and you had OneDrive on your computer, which like mapped to your phone, right, and then your TV or something like that, and if it was able to get up there and even then propagate to all those devices, that would be nifty.
So like redundant cross-pollination in your own local area.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
But you would have to be able to pick up that something was happening that they were encrypting at the moment.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's I would say backups, but like most people aren't going to back up. Is that fair?
Yeah.
I feel as if though most
that's
people
that's
won't back
really
up.
the number one thing.
But
right?
cloud
They
services are getting better as to where like it does it for you. So that's nice.
Yeah, it's the number one thing they bank on is backups, right? Because as a consumer, you do a nightly backup the next day. There a lot of people, if I had a nightly backup and all of a sudden I get hit at 9 a.m., I don't care. I'm not paying no ransom. I'm just going to re-image everything, So for a consumer, I'd say backups are important, but they also play on the fact that a lot of people don't. And a lot of people who do get hit, they sort of wage like, okay, like is 2 Bitcoins really worth all this data inside my computer? Or I have a USB drive that I could just reload
Yep.
everything with.
So my next point, hopefully we answered your question well. My next point goes to kind of really is all about all malware, right? If you have, depending on what platform you're trying to target, in most cases it's Windows. If you have knowledge of Windows internals and APIs and things like that, then you can probably write decent malware. I think, in my opinion, I think the knowledge of Windows internals that you need to write ransomware is less than the knowledge of Windows internals that you would need to write a decent banking Trojan, because the banking Trojan is looking to be more subversive, and you're looking to do crazy things with the API and be more crafty, if you will. Going on the simplicity thing still, ransomware projects exist for educational purposes, and this is kind of a fiery topic amongst some researchers, where I don't know why people like there's malware source that's leaked, and like you can look at the source code and go through line by line and understand what it does, right? But there's no reason anybody, in my mind, maybe someone can think of one and let me know. There's no reason that I can think of why you would want to give people who don't have the capability to write their own the capability to write their own. Because I guess the argument is what we're doing now isn't enough to stop what's going on. So let's make it open source, and maybe somebody will come up with an idea. Whereas I think the root of the problem is that it's not that ransomware is complicated and we have no idea how to not let it run, right? It's just that we don't have. This goes back to the kind of what Joe said in the keynote. The ability to stop phishing and that initial attack vector, like that's never going to stop. And this 9 times out of 10, ransomware payloads are probably going to be delivered. I guess actually exploit kits, but ransomware attempts are going to be delivered through phishing. 9 times out of 10 is a little much. I would say the majority of the time, though, that ransomware will be delivered through phishing. So I don't think that open source ransomware is really a necessity. It's not like if I had sourced some code or some web app, right, and I was able to find a 0-day, I wouldn't just spam. I would spam like a proof of concept that's not malicious or something like that. But these are in nature for educational purposes. They will encrypt your computer, whereas most of them have backdoors or something that they put in. There's no reason. I don't know. Thoughts on open source ransomware?
Well, I see a lot of malware in the wild. People will actually just copy and paste on Stack Overflow or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
In this particular case, I don't think we talked about this in this presentation, but I did find a post by somebody, it was several years ago, with almost the exact structure of the source code that appears in this piece of ransomware. And they modified a few things to make it fit for this particular scenario. So I mean it's questionable. I mean, when you're talking about things like proof of concept, some people argue that, well, if we know the number of methods in which they can attack or sort of hit our infrastructure, then we can prepare for them. Really, I don't know a good adequate defense for this, other than for the enterprise. Could tell you like a good enterprise threat data feed is like key. For a consumer,
Say it again.
for enterprise, like someone could provide you a good like threat data feed, like intelligence feed. So a lot of companies out there, I won't say a lot, but a good number of them they'll analyze a lot of malware, and then in their feed they'll give you a lot of indicators. And the reason that's important is because they're probably analyzing them and seeing the payloads faster than a company would. So by the time the company gets the payload, they're going to have those indicators. So a couple things are going to happen. Either they get infected and the payload can't communicate back to the C2, and in a lot of these cases, if the payload can't communicate, it's not going to start encryption. Another thing that's going to happen is it's not going to allow it through, right? So if we have those indicators, if we have the hashes of the payload, we have the indicators it's trying to communicate with, it's not going to get through. And even if it does get through, we can easily have something like SIEM software, or some IDS isolate that particular machine quickly off the network before it has a chance to do any more damage. So for the enterprise, someone with a good threat data feed is definitely going to help you out. Consumer is a little bit more difficult because those threat data feeds cost money. Big companies are paying a lot of money for them. Sometimes some of those companies do share those indicators, like with a partnership with an AV vendor. It doesn't happen as much, only because people are paying. People are selling that data.
Yeah, I just think there's like so many more mom-and-pop businesses out there too, enterprise. But enterprise has
Yeah.
much of a change.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like I guess you pay for what you get, unfortunately.
Moving on, kind of more of the compare and contrast. Like I said earlier, banking Trojans have many more moving parts. The delivery mechanisms really, I think banking Trojans probably are more consistently delivered through Word docs, where ransomware is a solid mixture of Word docs and Windows script or JavaScript files, I think more so, and exploit kits. With, like King had said earlier, sometimes if ransomware can't communicate with the command and control server, then it won't encrypt. Other times they don't really care; they're gonna encrypt anyway. They won't have track of the infection, but they'll still give you what you need to pay to get your files back. So, whereas banking Trojans, I think the command and control is a little more important because you actually have data to exfiltrate. And web injects, basically, what web injects are is, so like you navigate to your banking website, right? And the banking Trojan will basically script an overlay kind of on the fly, so that when you get to the banking website, you're logging into their scripted overlay, and that's how they grab your banking credentials and things like that. Anything to add on web injects, bud?
No.
All right, cool. The delivery mechanism, like I said earlier, kind of the one size fits all. Really, once they get the payload on your on the victim's computer, then all they need to do is get the victim to run the payload, and most people are going to click things regardless. So after that, it's just is the victim going to pay or not? So characteristics of modern ransomware. Delivery methods we kind of touched on, mostly sent through phishing emails, inside zip files. What was big over the last 3 weeks really is like encrypted Word documents, where the Word document's password protected. Those come through with zero detection, essentially, and they provide you the password in the email to open the Word doc, and then they have the classic enable macros to view this content. Or yeah, something along those lines, and then the macros will run and download the second stage payload. That was the kind of the coolest thing that I saw over the last 3 weeks or 4 weeks probably. A variety of malicious actors as far as skill level goes. You have like the full development teams behind Locky and Server and the larger ransomware campaigns, and then you have more new threat actors, if you will, kind of like the author behind Alma Ransomware. This is probably their first run at creating ransomware, and there's a lot of new ransomware out there that isn't done well because even kids new to the block are trying to make money using this vector, right? That's why 2016 is the year of ransomware, because it's really exploded. So everybody wants a part of the potential success that ransomware offers. So going over, kind of touching on low quality ransomware, this will lead into our more of what we found back in August. Like I said, everybody wants a piece of the chunk. Everybody wants a piece of the success that ransomware has to offer. So like I said, you get new variants and new families all the time. Like even back in 2016, I remember, not 2016, we're still here. Back in February, it was the first day Locky was out. Somebody was able to crack it, or first couple of days, and the next iteration of the payload, it came with string inside the payload. It was like FU security researchers or something similar to that. So even versions of Locky went through iterations where they weren't perfect. Same with Cerber. Checkpoint was actually able to supply a decryptor up until, I think it was Cerber. Was it version Cerber 2 then? Definitely Cerber 2 was out. I don't think Cerber 3 was out yet, but up until when they put that out, I think it was around August 18th-ish, when they put out their blog in the Decrypter, they were able to decrypt files up until then, and then shortly after, like the next 2 days, Cerber came out and patched the weakness in their encryption mechanism to mitigate that. Petya, a bunch of ransomware families have been able to undergo cracking and decryption by some security researchers, and then you have low quality family variants like Stempato, NudeCrypt, Fabiansomeware, which I think is like on version 4 in Phoenix Locker, all of which I don't think they have perfect encryption yet. I don't know that to be 100% true, but last time I checked that was the case. So now talking more about what we had found and our bread and butter in August. Can you take it away?
Sure. So, those of you who haven't or don't know, in some Slavic languages and also in Hungarian, Alma is the word for apple. And what we found was the payload itself was masquerading or trying to trick a user into thinking that the file itself belonged to Apple. We thought that was kind of interesting where they called it Alma with that string in there. Alma Locker, so a lot of people called it Alma Locker. Bleeping Computer, who was some other ones? There's a difference between a locker and ransomware. Locker is just trying to prevent access to the computer, as opposed to ransomware is actually encrypting the files. So when it first came out, there's a reason we came out with Alma Ransomware and everyone kept calling it Alma Locker. So you'll see a lot of other blogs out there saying Alma Locker. It's the same thing, it's just not a locker. I guess some people don't understand certain types of terminology. So this particular one was delivered via RIG exploit kit, very popular exploit kit. So it wasn't a phishing email or anything like that. If those of you who don't know how exploit kits work, basically it's as simple as visiting a website. All you have to do is visit a website and it could cause infection. The way this works is the exploit kit determines what your browser is vulnerable to, or perhaps you have a plugin that's vulnerable to something. And a bunch of JavaScript runs and determines, okay, that they're running, Internet Explorer with this particular plugin, and what they do is they try to deliver a certain malicious file or malicious payload onto the system via that vulnerability. And that's why it's hard to defend against exploit kits, is because the only thing that you have for yourself is keeping your browser and your plugins up to date. That's the only defense you have, really.
You have to run it after that?
No. So exploit kit, it's going to provide the execution. It's going to provide the drop, and it's going to provide the execution. A lot of people who do these exploit kits, it's crimeware as a service. So they're not actually, you can't go out there and buy like your own exploit kit. What they're doing is you rent like say a day.
So many days or hours to use the exploit kit, right? So in this case, which is, I thought this was odd that such a new payload or simplistic payload really as far as ransomware goes was being delivered via RIG, because once Angler had gotten popped back in June, Angler was really the premier exploit kit. RIG kind of took over and tried to fill Angler's shoes. So I was very surprised to see this being delivered by RIG. That was odd.
I think we calculated that the threat actor paid around $500 for this particular payload to circulate.
There's actually two different versions now.
Of RIG out there?
Yeah, so there's RIG like standard,
Okay.
and then there's RIG V2, which is like the VIP level of stuff.
Nice.
So even as an account with just limited user could still get popped because there's an exploit within your browser plugins or whatnot.
Right. So
It's also notable too. There's a billion UAC bypasses out there, right? That's not hard to craft. If you've written an exploit kit, you can write a UAC bypass. But like DLL side loading, that'll bypass UAC most of the time. So Cerber, I think a month ago, Cerber didn't get executed with admin privileges. It would prompt 3 times after a minute each time for you to execute it as admin or for it to bump its privs up. This is because it couldn't. I don't think it could get the ETC shadow, or not ETC shadow, the shadow copy of the shadow drive.
yeah, volume shadow.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean.
Yeah, so if it couldn't get to that, if it wasn't running as admin, or some sensitive files that it wanted to encrypt, and it would prompt you 3 times, and if it didn't get to it, it would still encrypt. just not everything that it wanted.
Yeah, that's another thing you have going for yourself, that a lot of ransomwares will do is disable the volume shadow service. And what that does is, if you ever booted up Windows and says there was something wrong, try to boot up from the last known good startup, and what it's doing is pulling copies from that volume shadow service to try to bring things back online. So the first thing some ransomware will do is just disable it altogether and wipe it out.
You don't think that like Sophos intercept, where they always back up the shadow copies, is that going to be good? Just to disable it?
I don't know. I don't know about Sophos architecture.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with how that works, but if they are backing up the shadow copy, then
Yeah.
and it can't access it, I don't know where the backup goes. Like, that's really it, right? Like, if they encrypt the backup, then.
It could be a good defense. Yeah, I'd have to look more into that.
Mm-hmm.
So the problem here is when we first saw it, it was tripped by one vendor, and I can't remember who that was.
Can't remember either.
Basically, we checked, I think it was a month later, and it was like, I think it was 2 or 3 vendors had this flagged as malicious. And then only a couple of them actually knew it was ransomware. So, I mean, AV's pretty bad. I would say there's 2. I mean, I'll just go out there and say it. Hate to say it, but Windows actually has a good antivirus. Yeah. I mean, they know the OS better than most, so like their detection rates are actually pretty good. I would say Malwarebytes does a pretty good job. Kaspersky does a pretty good job. The rest of them are questionable. That's based on everything that we see. We look at a lot of different stuff, mostly ransomware and banking Trojans.
Shameless plugs, bud.
Yeah. So I didn't mean to throw that out there, but I was trying to help out some consumers. But those are the major 3 that we've seen that have the best. So. Those of you who don't know what address space layout randomization is, ASLR, basically what happens is it takes a executable and it will load it in a random place in memory in an effort to prevent things like buffer overflows. This is more of a defense mechanism, so that way people can't perform exploitation. What was interesting about this binary is it actually had ASLR enabled. And it's just a sly little trick. It's something that's easily disabled. If you look inside of the file header, the executable file header, there's actually, if you see where I'm pointing to, it says DLL can move. You can all, like in this particular section, or this application here, CFF Explorer, that particular checkbox is what changes that information in the header. And basically what that does is, if that wasn't checked, basically what would happen, it was constantly loaded in the same location every time. It doesn't really hinder analysis, because like I said, we can load this up, we can uncheck that, and reload the executable, and when we do our debugging session again, it's going to be at the place we expect it to in memory. So as analysts, what we do is we look at a lot of different malicious software, and we use things like IDA, or Ollie, X64DBG.
Debuggers.
A lot of these things allow us to step through the assembly code to see what the malicious payload's doing. And in this case, it's just like it's a noobish sort of thing to try to prevent analysis for some people. And it did trip some people up who use more automated fashion. So people who use sort of automated debugging may have gotten some funky results by this. So it was just one thing we noticed with this particular payload.
We got about 15 minutes. Just
I can speed it up.
All right.
All right. So the network activity here you see here is from the encryptor. When it first starts to encrypt your files on your computer. And one thing that Jason alluded to is sometimes they'll encrypt your files even though they don't have an internet connection. And if that's the case, a lot of times what they're using is something called Symmetric Key Cryptography. And what that is you have one key used for both encryption and decryption. Another way someone could do this is asymmetric, and you see some other ransomwares do this, is you have like PGP, right? You have 2 keys. And they have a very close mathematical relationship in the fact that if you take one key and encrypt data with this one key, only this other key can decrypt it, and so on and so forth. So that you see this with PGP with a private and public key. So you keep your private key and you share your public key, so that way if people want to send you files that don't get intercepted, they can encrypt with your public key and you can decrypt with your private key. So what happens is some of the ransomware will take advantage of this asymmetric cryptography and the fact that they'll generate the key pair on the server, send you one of the keys, encrypt everything, so you never actually have the other key on your box. So you can't, there's no way to really decrypt. I mean, you could potentially do it, you'd brute force it, but I mean, by the time you get your data, it's about 20 years, whether it's important to you then or not, I guess that's up to you. So in this particular case, they're using symmetric key cryptography. And a lot of people who haven't seen any sort of data that looks like what we're pointing to there, where it says base 64, what it is it's just a simple encoding. Use, send messages, email attachments over the internet. And what they're all printable characters, and that's the reason a lot of people use this encoding, so it's easy to transfer data. So this sort of simplistic piece of ransomware will send the initial response over the server, and if we actually base 64 decoded that, you're going to see a value indicated by P. And if you see this value right here, that's actually the encryption key. It's actually AES, also known as the Rindale cipher. So they're using that in an effort to encrypt the files on the computer. After the encryptor runs, you're going to get this, with all ransomware, you're going to get the bummer message here saying, sorry, your files are pretty much locked now. So they want you to pay here. So they give you instructions downloading the decryptor, and that way you can go and get your files back if you want to. Extortion, I guess. So the decryptor, a lot of the tools we use in the community vary. There's several different tools to do the same thing. This particular tool, what it does is it takes signatures, basically a database of signatures, and uses those signatures to try to identify what the file is. Sort of like AV does it. So you have, or like Yara. So basically you have a bunch of signatures that will identify what made the payload or what kind of packer was used to make it, what compiler was used. This particular instance, EXE-info tells us something very interesting. It says this is a .NET payload. If you see under there where it says Visual C Sharp, Basic .NET, it's very important to us because we're going to show you in a second why. If there was a packer in play, we might see it in there. If it was written in Delphi, you'll probably see something that said in Borland. Another popular tool that's like this is something called PEID that was used for many years. This is the decryptor. So they give you instructions to download a decryptor. Here they give you a Bitcoin address. If you see, not on the box furthest to my left, but to the left, second over, you see that 4SVKJU. It picked a random extension to encrypt your files with, and this is the particular section after our first execution. To the right, you see how much money we have to pay to get our files back. And here we have our hours remaining to pay our ransom. And those of you who are not familiar with ransomware, if you don't pay the ransom within the time allotted, it varies. Most people just up the ransom. They double it. So instead of paying 1 Bitcoin, you got to pay 2, etc. So based on this, they give you some places where you can go buy your Bitcoins and pay them off, and you can click check payment, and what it does is it tries to see if you paid the ransom or not. So when the decryptor is run, it sends some information back to the C2. So what we did was we loaded up something called Wireshark. There's other tools out there, a Microsoft Network Monitor. Anything that captures traffic will show you stuff like this on the right. So what you see here is it's using a personal identifier to send back and forth between the victim and the C2, and some other information you see coming back is the wallet ID, the extension being used, how many hours are left, as well as the ransom amount. And then once again, you'll see on the bottom here, I know it's hard to see this here, but if you look, the response is almost like sort of attached to the first initial request. So if you look at it like where the red sort of drops off where I have that first arrow, then you'll see the response. So like the HTTP 200, there's a response from the server, and there's another post from us, and then the next response from the server. It's kind of hard. We probably should have wrapped
It up.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the decryptor does two posts. The first post to i.php is just the victim's identifier to inform the C2 which victim is trying to communicate with or to inform the C2 which victim is trying to communicate with it, and the the C2 will then respond with, like King had said, the Bitcoin wallet address, the 4-character extension, just the things that we saw populated in the decryptor on the previous slide, and then again it posts to c.php, or what I believe stands for check, to see if the victim has paid, check if the victim is paid, and it just responds with the wallet address.
With this example, were you on the Tor, or was that?
So the command and control was on Tor.
Yeah. Well, it's communicating over Tor, wherever that server was, somewhere, right? So Tor is just like an anonymizing service. So it was communicating with .onion.
Well, that's a .onion.link. Is that like just a normal public internet proxy?
No, the onion's a Tor.
Sorry?
The onion would be a Tor.
Well, it's
Yeah.
.onion.link.
.onion.link. So it's a way of getting at Tor services without having a Tor browser. So that's what they were doing here.
Yeah, because the people are getting infected by this don't have Tor.
Yeah. Because if you try to go straight to .onion without running
Yeah,
some
and
sort
I
of...
believe in the initial infection page, like if you can't navigate to one of these four nodes or whatever they gave you, then they provide you with the link to download Tor.
So the reason I was talking about before why this is important that the payload's written in .NET is because there's some very popular tools out there that allow thank you. There's some very popular tools out there that allow you to sort of pull a lot of metadata out of there, and with .NET it's similar to Java. So when you compile Java code, it turns into something called bytecode. So it's not straight native code that's running on the CPU. All right. So basically what happens is it compiles to something called intermediate language, or IL. And IL contains so much metadata that we get pretty much almost the same exact source code that the developer wrote. And in this case, you can see we got pretty much everything back. They had a little bit of obfuscation, but not much. And so this right here you're seeing is the initial post from the decryptor to the command and control, checking to see if we paid our ransom. So you say you have a file on your computer, a TXT file. Once it's encrypted and you try to open it, you're going to see something like this. This is just the result of the AES encryption happening with the key we showed earlier. Now, those of you who took Jason Gilliam's class learned about things like Burp, Beef, all these other different tools. Fiddler is another tool that we can do sort of man-in-the-middle attacks. So what we can do here is, as you can see, when we run the decryptor, on the right there, the first box you see where it says decrypt traffic, what we're selecting there is the decryptor that's running. And then what we do towards the bottom here is break upon post, because what happens is the decryptor is going to try to do an HTTP post back to the C2 in an effort to sort of communicate.
Playing on the fact that this actor, in my opinion, was new to the scene of malware. Really, shortly after the campaign went live, the command and control went down, and you were no longer able to download the decryptor, which just goes to show how really not robust the infrastructure was in this case. So like he said, in what we're about to do basically is act as the C2 and provide the decryptor with the data necessary to decrypt the victim's files.
So you see it, we hit the break, hit posted, and what we do here is we are supplying a DAT file. The reason we do that is in the bottom right there, you can't really type stuff into Fiddler. So you have to supply a file with our data. And here we're sending back data pretending we're the command and control center back to the decryptor running on the victim's machine.
So yeah, I'll just add a little bit. What you do, like he said, we're going to break on post. So as the post goes through initially, we crafted a .dat file, and you can choose response there. You probably can't read that checkbox or drop-down box, but we were able to populate the data file with the data necessary for the decryptor to believe that we were the C2. And it was a lot of fun at first. Like I was like making like 500 bitcoins in like -7 hours to pay, and doing like all these crazy things to see what the decryptor would do. So it was we had a little fun with it first.
The next response that we assumed was going to go back to the decryptor, since we weren't sure exactly since the C2 went offline, was the key. So all we did was send back the key to the decryptor. And that's what you're seeing here in the bottom right. We choose, after another break on post, we choose a DAT file that contains the AES key. It populates on the bottom right there. And then we can click run to completion. And when we do that, you'll notice that on the bottom, now we have what we didn't have enabled before, where you see decrypt single file and decrypt all files. We have the ability to start our decryption process. So basically what you just saw there is similar technique a lot of hackers use to do man-in-the-middle attack, except instead of doing it to a victim, we're actually doing it to this piece of ransomware. And if you see the decryption key that's been populated up there, sort of put a box around it. And after running it, we can see that we can get our text back from our particular file that was encrypted earlier. The reason this is important is because you can see some sort of the weaknesses that exist in some of the malware. Obviously, this might help some people out there who are actually in the field. There are certain ways that you can sort of protect users by knowing this sort of information. It's one of the reasons that we release information like this, sort of share with the community what we found. It might be useful for others. And, you know, as we go through and see some of these ransomware variants, we've seen a rise, dramatic increase in the number of low-quality ransomware such as this. What I said before is this particular piece of ransomware had source code from a Microsoft forum that was straight copied and pasted with a little bit of variations. A lot of people are not doing much work. They're taking some of those proof of concepts and they're taking them, making them into their own ransomware campaigns in an effort, you know, to make a quick buck. So
the second and third point, I want to point out that they're not really contradictory, because what I wanted to get at here was that teams of malicious actors will work together to continually progress their payloads with lower detection. And like I said earlier, once they have the encryption correct, all they really need to worry about is getting it onto the victim's computer and getting it run. While I do expect to see more and more ransomware of lower quality as newer actors try to basically make money or get a chunk of the ransomware cake.
Yeah, it's a mass blast thing, right? They don't care who they encrypt. They just want people to get encrypted. And it's just the reason people are banking on it now, and there's so much of it, is because it's working. And since it's working, everybody's trying to get a piece of the pie. So they're sending out payloads like crazy in an effort to get. So even if they get 4 bitcoins, they don't care. And then what's funny is if you actually go back and negotiate with them, you can be like, "Oh, I don't have 4 bitcoins. How about I pay you 2?" Like, a lot of them will actually take it and give you the decryption key. So keep that in mind.
So our non-shameless plugs. Shout out to Charleston B-Sides for having us. We really appreciate it, guys. Thanks to PhishLabs for letting us take the time and giving us the resources to do the investigation on Alma. And thanks to all of you for coming out here and checking out our talk today. We really appreciate it. Quick references? Questions? What's up?
Just trying to figure out or understand how the man-in-the-middle attack got the key to send back and how it accepted it, or how did you know what to use there?
Because we saw the initial key go across, right? Because it was using symmetric encryption. So we saw the key go across during the original encryption.
Okay.
So it was trying to tell the C2 in the base 64 encoded data. 1, 2, right here. Yeah, so this first chunk right here is this P equals, is that first chunk of, I mean, it's probably hard for you to see, but it's CDX or whatever goes across there. So if you base64 decode that, it's the first value is the key, along with other metadata about the victim's computer.
There is also a weakness in the algorithm. We didn't publish this, but we did find out there's about 5 different artifacts that it uses on the user's computer to generate the key. So knowing that as well, we don't necessarily need the key from this as well. There's another way we could get at the key by knowing certain information about the computer.
So it's not the same symmetric key each time?
It will be the same. It's
Some
different.
of the MAC address was taken into account.
Yeah.
Was it system time? I feel like
Yeah. There were certain
it
things.
took several values into
Yeah.
account to basically threw them into a vendor and spit out an AES key.
Yeah.
Blender. My
So if
apologies.
someone used like asymmetric encryption, it would be that much harder, and do you think they don't do that because
Well, an asymmetric, right? The private key or the key you would need to decrypt would probably be on the server.
Yeah. So it's just a noobish way. It's easier to deal with symmetric key encryption when it comes to it. So I think they're just copy and pasting code. And in this effort, they didn't need you to connect to the internet to start encrypting. A lot of those asymmetric things, what they do is they generate the key pair on the command and control server, and then they grab a key from there, and then they start encrypting. So in this particular case, maybe they were worried that they wouldn't be able to encrypt certain, I don't know.
So did y'all dump all the keys for like your new ID?
Well, we thought about it. We released a generic decryptor that sort of helps. If we had, we might do a follow-up blog, but if we had the particular machine that was infected with certain other information, say at the time of infection, which we could easily get, we could recreate the key that was used to encrypt. Yeah.
So was this sold as like as a crimeware kit, like an affiliate program, or do you think the person who wrote this conducted campaigns?
I feel as if that was a solo operation.
So
I'm not going to say, but I'm pretty sure I know who wrote it.
nice.
And the reason is because it is someone in the community, in the field. Yeah. So you see that too, right? You see a lot of people in the field. Like some people may be like, oh, like Jason pointed out, they're making like all this money. I'm going to try to get in on that. So you have your white hats and black hats, and you have the gray hats. You sort of have this white hat hacker job, and by night they're writing shitty ransomware.
Is his name Jason Davis?
It is.
It would be of the shittiest quality if it was me.
This is all HTTP in plain text.
Right.
No
Mhm.
SSL at all.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Good.
Like
Yeah.
I said, like a lot of ransomware, even if you look at Locky has made probably the most money in the ransomware field. Locky is not a complicated payload. It's not very complicated at all. And the reason is because a lot of malware authors, even with banking Trojans, they're going to take the least amount of effort for it to run and get as many victims as possible. So like say they expect their campaign to run for a day or two, and most of the victims are going to get in that first day. So say it takes you 3 days to reverse their payload. They don't care. By that time, they've already spit out another binary with new C2, so they don't care if you reverse it or not.
You almost get into like behavioral profiling. I mean, so these are guys that, instead of doing a 9-to-5 job, that's the route that they chose to do.
Mhm.
So they'd rather, spit this stuff out and then, have enough time for hookers and blow.
Yeah. Yep. With plenty of money for it.
You know?
Are you seeing more and more on like different architectures, like live phone or?
So I've done a lot of mobile in the past year, like actual mobile stuff. And the coolest mobile Android exploits that I've seen. So I haven't seen much iOS stuff. There's stuff out there, but it was an exploit kit delivering. GeoHot's wrote a towel root exploit, which was a silent root back in 2014. So the problem with Android is, right, like a lot of they're stuck on previous versions. So they were able to basically silently root the phone and then execute the payload as root, which was able to, like, I think it was a locker. So yeah, they encrypted the phone. So mobile platforms are being targeted more with craftier payloads coming out, which is kind of cool.
Yeah. You see a lot of the usage nowadays. Most people use their mobile device, as stated earlier. So we expect to see a rise in those things, like IoT, mobile devices.
Cool.
So your Bluetooth toilet's probably not going to work. Put you in a shitty situation.
Thanks, guys.